Thank you. Members of the House, opposition, and esteemed chair. Anyone who has been tricked into eating a tofu burger knows that environmental terrorism lurks among us all. I don't think I need to convince you that our governments have thus far failed us in the fight against climate change. Our leaders cannot make concrete global agreements. Even if all commitments from the 2016 Paris Climate Agreement were reached, the world would still experience a warming of 3 degrees Celsius. In Ireland, while the Green Party is making gains and climate strikes have swept the country, neither of the 2 major parties in power are poised to make the drastic systemic change needed to decarbonize the country. Something must change. But does that change need to be violent? Do we believe that environmental terrorism can be justified? Now, I imagine that a lot of people tonight will want to talk about movements such as Extinction Rebellion and whether that counts as environmental terrorism. And tonight, I want to remind you that these are not acts of violence and do not even remotely skirt the terrorism border. Instead, this conversation must focus on those who are forced to use violence to fight environmental injustice. And I'll do so by first defining environmental terrorism, considering it as a form of civil disobedience, and concluding that in claiming to act for the entire human community, modern environmental movements must be ready to justify violence by those who have no other political powers. Now, the academic consensus says there really isn't such a thing as environmental terrorism. According to a study by Carson and colleagues in 2012, out of 1,069 criminal incidents by environmental groups from 1970 to 2009, none of them claimed lives, and 87.3% were forms of property damage, such as spiking trees, pouring sugar in bulldozer gas tanks, or burning down ski lodges. Now, this environmental terrorism is political violence. It damages property. However, just because something is a form of political violence does not make it terrorism. Terrorism is violence against citizens to inflict psychological damage using fear as a means to achieve a political end. Now, XR is not environmental terrorism. It causes a joyful nuisance and makes Marion Square a lot more fun, but does not use fear and destruction to achieve its political ends. And we'd have to be seriously starving for political drama if we consider that gluing yourself to the doll is considered a terrorist act. Now, environmental terrorism we really need to be talking about is where and how violence is used to resolve environmental justice, and whether or not that is a legitimate form of civil disobedience. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. states that civil disobedience is meant to, quote, create a crisis and foster such tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue, unquote. According to King, civil disobedience is justified when A, it is faithful to the law, i.e. participants are ready to accept legal punishment, and B, its ultimate goal is to return to a negotiation with the state. Now, King envisioned civil disobedience as spotlighting a particular injustice in an otherwise just world in which the state can be trusted to act in good faith. Now, if that is the case, which for the most part we're lucky to experience in our own societies, then violence can't be justified because it refuses to acknowledge the state as an actor of justice. But I have news for you, ladies and gentlemen. This is not an otherwise just world. The vast majority of people do not live under accountable and just states, and we can't assume that our privilege is the norm. Angelovsky and Allier propose an environmentalism of the poor in which those who directly depend on the physical environment for their livelihood, for their community identity, are forced to be environmentalists to protect their existence. In a global economic system that forces states to favor development over human dignity, citizens who threaten the expansion of material industries such as mining, logging, and agribusiness are met with violence. According to The Guardian in 2017, 207 environmental activists were killed, a rate of 4 a week. Police and military forces were directly responsible for 43 of these killings. In 2013, the Ethiopian government forcibly relocated and villagized 225,000 indigenous peoples from their land in Gambela to make room for foreign agricultural investors. Those who refused to resettle were beaten, sexually assaulted, or killed. According to Global Witness in 2015, 3 activists who opposed the Los Enchinos hydroelectric dam in Honduras were found tortured and dismembered. The activists Ana and Rosaura Miriam, both heavily pregnant, were severely beaten in their home by a group of 30 heavily armed Honduran police and civilians. Ana was hospitalized for 11 days and Rosaura lost her child. When these communities are systematically excluded from the political sphere and met with violence, the vast majority respond peacefully, but many have little means of political expression but to reciprocate this violence. In the Niger Delta, where the Ogoni and Ija people live, the Nigerian government leases the land to the Shell and Chevron Corporation since 1956 to export its petroleum. Since then, 1.5 million tons of oils have been discharged into the Delta's water and soil, increasing human lead absorption by over 90% and aggravating asthma and cancer in the local population. After the Ogonis and Ijas threatened mass action to disrupt oil company operations in 1994, the Nigerian government killed 2,000 civilians and displaced a further 100,000. The local population responded by turning off oil valves and attacking oil installations, forcing the government to capitulate to their demands. In the Guatemalan Civil War from 1960 to 1983, the insurgent guerrilla army of the poor was largely supported by the Maya population in northern highlands, who feared being evicted from their land from foreign mining companies backed by the state. To weaken the insurgency, the Guatemalan military killed and forcibly disappeared 166,000 Maya. After pressure from guerrilla forces aided by Mayan intelligence and support, as well as international pressure after the release of indigenous activist Rigoberto Menchu's memoir of the genocide, the Guatemalan government was forced to return to democracy in 1984. Those who suffer the most environmental violence do not live in otherwise just societies, but systematically unjust ones in which the state considers their lives to be externalities. We enjoy an arsenal of political tools, but most people in the world do not, forcing some of them towards violence. Now, I'm not advocating for us here in Ireland or in other countries that are privileged with democracy to use violence to demand climate action. To do so is an insult to the people who have no other options but violence. But we have to remember that we are no longer just a people. We're a planet. And if in our fight for climate action we claim to act in the name of the entire human community, we have to think on the scale of the entire human community. And we can't limit ourselves to just thinking within our own borders. Therefore, in order to stand with those who are forced to defend themselves, this House must believe that environmental terrorism can be justified. Thank you.